I came to you this evening to talk about Abraham Lincoln. What I'm going to do is talk tonight in terms of Tad Lincoln's father. Now, where that comes from is from a little book. It's one of my favorites that I've read about Abraham Lincoln. I find there's a lot of different histories and so forth you can read about this man and about his family. Realistically, on the topic of Abraham Lincoln, there's over 5,000 books published out there. Many of them are very factual. It's down to the point where they've printed up virtually all of his letters, all of his speeches, all of his talks in a 10, 12-volume set of books called the Collected Works. They've analyzed all those letters, analyzed account books of the drugstore in Springfield, looked at other people's letters and diaries. They've put together a day-by-day account of his life. He never kept a diary. He never wrote his own memoirs, obviously. In fact, he scarcely said anything about his life prior to the presidency of the United States. Anything that we know about Abraham Lincoln, his family life, his early life, realistically his life as a lawyer, we know through the reminiscing of others and the stories that they remembered. When you start reminiscing about people, it's remembering events that have taken place in the past. And people's memories tend to elaborate on some accounts and they tend to forget details on other accounts. Some people glorified and deified Lincoln within a couple of years of his death. Probably the most prolific biographer he had would have been his law partner of 14 years, William Herndon. Herndon wrote a book called The Life of Lincoln. He actually collected a manuscript and a lot of notes and materials on Abraham Lincoln's life. Lincoln, after the ceremonies and funeral in Springfield, Herndon more or less dropped aside the practice of law and started writing letters to his former law associates and people that had practiced law with Lincoln throughout the 8th Judicial Circuit, all out throughout central Illinois. He contacted his family members. He wrote distant cousins down in Kentucky and Tennessee. He got a hold of school friends of his from the Indiana years when they lived down there. And he started collecting all of these manuscripts and different things that people had written about him. He turned around and sold those manuscripts to Ward Lamon, another former law partner of Lincoln, who wrote a biography. Where they got into trouble is this. They basically told the truth about Mary Lincoln while Mary Lincoln was still alive. Mrs. Lincoln suffered from migraine headaches. She had suffered a lot of losses in her life. Some said she was mentally unbalanced. She basically suffered with a great deal of depression and illness in addition to that. She was not a very easy person to live with, as can be said by most of the biographers that have written about her. The woman, I think, has been scorned greatly by history and greatly by the people of her own time. She was greatly abused as the First Lady of the United States. Washington society did not want to accept this country bumpkin of sorts, and yet Mary Lincoln was prolific in speaking French. She was a very snappy dresser, but she was also very irrational in the way she spent money, irrational in her dealings with people. She was very jealous of any woman speaking to her husband, and she made consequentially a lot of people very uncomfortable. William Herndon more or less came out and told the truth. The whole truth and nothing but the truth. He elaborated on the truth. He started saying that Lincoln's great melancholy and depression that he had in his life was tied to his unhappy relationship from his wife, and he had never really loved her. He actually loved a woman named Anne Rutledge, who from the New Salem days that had died a number of years before. This completely enraged Lincoln's son, Robert Lincoln, and Mary Lincoln, and there was a lot of controversy about all of Herndon's writing. As time has went by and many biographers have proven and more people have talked and told stories, much of the truth has come out. Mrs. Lincoln was rather irrational and hard to deal with, but in Victorian times it wasn't really proper to say that. I find as I read through Lincoln's writings, his speeches and so forth, I find them very interesting. I find, however, more fascinating the stories that people tell about him, the people that remembered him, especially those people who knew him fairly well and got to see him up close. A few of the books that I've brought up here are different reminiscences about Abraham Lincoln. What I wanted to talk to you this evening about is one of them that was written by a young girl that basically spent a lot of time in the White House. Her name was Julia Taft Bain. Julia was a little girl, 16 years old. She had two brothers named Bud and Holly Taft. They were the same age as Lincoln's youngest sons. And Willie and Tad Lincoln were the two boys in the White House. Robert Lincoln was about 17 years old, and he was in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and getting ready to enter Harvard Law School. He was in the academy up there, the Exeter Academy. So the Lincoln boys were in the White House. Much of what has been said about the Lincoln boys, of them being terrors, is also pretty well true. The Lincolns were completely uncharacteristic of Victorian families where children were to be seen and not heard. Discipline was very strict through the 1800s, especially on children. The Lincolns, however, had lost a young boy named Edward Baker Lincoln. He was their second son. He was Robert's little brother. They never had four sons. They had four sons. They never had four at the same time. They had little Robert. Eddie died while they were still living in Springfield in 1850. A couple of years later, Willie came along, and a couple of years after that, Tad came along. Tad's name was actually Thomas, for Abraham Lincoln's father. Tad was literally the terror of the White House. I think losing the child earlier in their marriage, losing little Eddie, probably let him dote on the other boys a little more. Robert's upbringing had been somewhat stricter. The Lincoln boys run wild throughout the White House. They had their friends over there. Julia Bain talks about the man that most people called the president. The children, half of them called him Paul, and the rest of them called him Mr. President with a southern accent. She talks stories about coming into the White House meeting rooms in the early years of the Civil War. This was really before some of the battles had taken place. Right after the Lincoln's inauguration in March of 1861, the Union was basically just starting to fall apart. The southern states had started to secede, the state of Mississippi and South Carolina being some of the first. Jefferson Davis was actually inaugurated as president of the Confederate States during Lincoln's inaugural journey to Washington. So Lincoln had a lot on his plate, so to speak. He was coming up, reading through the Constitution, trying to think, what can I do to help hold this country together? He had the weight of that on him. He was trying to raise an army to defend against Southern attack. Washington was then, as it is yet, very much a Southern city. He basically had to sneak through the city of Baltimore. He took about a 13-day trip from Springfield, Illinois, to Washington, D.C. They took the Great Western Railway to Indianapolis, down to Cincinnati, up to Cleveland, Ohio. They made kind of an inaugural journey. They ended up in New York City, down to Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. By the time they got to Harrisburg, it had become quite clear that the police in Baltimore had no inclination whatsoever to try and protect the president-elect as he passed through that southern city. Riot was expected. Assassination was probable. There was a plot in place basically to try and take his life as he passed through a tunnel between two train stations and transfer trains. And it was decided that Lincoln would have to enter the city of Washington under cover of night. He was hidden, whisked away in an unknown train and taken into the city. The press just butchered him on this. He had this great inaugural journey throughout the United States and then had to sneak in Washington through the back door basically at night to try and avoid trouble. He did not want to do that. However, he did it to protect his family and the others in the presidential party. These are some of the things that were all on his mind as he got into Washington those early years, those very first days of the war. One of the first things they did was get a hold of this Senator Taft. Senator Taft had the two little boys who would become the Lincoln Playmates. And they would romp around the White House. They said, send the boys around. Within a couple days of the inauguration, the Taft boys started coming to the White House. Their older sister, Julia, would accompany them. She was basically the 16-year-old babysitter for two 9-year-old and two 5-year-old boys. Basically, they run amok throughout the entire house. They had a little soldier doll that was sent to them. It was a model of a little Zouave soldier, all dressed in a fancy uniform. They would regularly court-martial him and bury him in the rose garden, much to the discernment of the gardeners that were out there. They would, the chefs preparing dinner would have strawberries ready for a special presidential levee that evening. The boys would get in and eat all the strawberries for dessert. They would go into the attic of the White House and romp and play around. One day the boys were missing for about 5-6 hours. Nobody could find them. Finally, the boys showed, can you imagine being in Washington, D.C., having 4 little boys, just letting them loose to run around the city of Washington. They got loose. They decided to go down to the Capitol. They got lost down in the deep basements and catacombs of the Capitol where all the storage of papers are. Literally were lost and started crying for help, and finally some custodian found them, put them in a carriage, bought them dinner, and sent them back home. That was the kind of life that the boys led. A very carefree life. Their parents not really saying anything about it. Whenever these great trying days of the early Civil War were starting and Lincoln was putting his cabinet in place, they would have grave meetings long in the hours of the night there in the White House. Lincoln's offices during his days in the White House were literally on the second floor in the family chambers, what they consider now the family chambers of the White House, was also his personal office. Half of the floor was where their bedrooms were. The other half is where his secretaries lived and worked. His secretaries literally lived right there with them. So it was very much a public home. They had people coming and going all hours of the day and night from this home. And the boys pretty much just fit right into the routine of things, watching the people come and go. They would bring in young boys off the street for other playmates. They would bring them in and say, "Paul, we want to give him supper. He doesn't have anything to eat." And readily the Lincolns would have a guest at their dinner table that evening. One of the most amusing stories that she tells in her book, Julia Taft Bain lived to be quite an old age. She lived to be up in her 80s, about 85. Before she passed away, she had been frequently called on to tell her Lincoln stories from the White House. They were around there for about a year. They had about a year-long association with the Lincolns. And Julia basically decided to reminisce and write her stories about the Lincoln boys. She wrote it long after her own brothers had passed away and long after the Lincoln boys had also passed away. She wrote this book in 1932. And it's a small book. The only place I know you can get it's very hard to find. It is up here at the Greenville College Library. She wrote that book as a memoir for her own family members. She wanted to write it so her grandchildren have something to remember of her days that she remembered in the White House. One of the stories she told in there was about the Great White House Snowstorm. The Lincoln boys had been telling the Taft boys all about the snowstorms back in Illinois. And this boy in the 1850s, Illinois did have some pretty fierce winters. Through the 1830s and 50s, we were throughout a period of that time when we did have some rather fierce winter seasonal weather here, and there was a lot of snow in those years. Washington, D.C. is far enough south that very rarely gets a snowstorm, and at that period of time had not had any. Taft boys had never seen snow, and they kept hoping and praying through the Christmas of 1861 that there would be a snowstorm. The snowflakes would come once in a while, and then they would vanish. So one day, the boys decided to create their own snowstorm. They disappeared for about a day. Nobody had seen hide or hair of them. Nobody knew where they disappeared to. Julia was sent to look for them. They had a guest at their house, and she was supposed to round up her brothers. Whenever she went to the White House, she looked high and low and couldn't find them. She finally ended up going up to the attic, the third floor of the White House, and there she finally come across the boys, and they were basically having a snowstorm. The snowstorm that they had were calling cards. At the White House during those early years, and this was up until really the turn of the century, they would have days where there was a reception to meet the president. Anybody wanted to get in line could get in line. They would walk you right through the front door of the White House. They'd put a gangplank out of the east room of the state dining room, and you'd literally walk through the White House, shake hands with them, hand him your card, shake hands with the president, and walk out. And the president would stand there and shake, and they did this up through about the Cleveland administration up in the 1890s. They would have thousands of people line up to walk through the White House and meet and greet the president. Well, they'd just wear them out, shaking 5,000 hands. As they came through, they would all hand their visiting cards to them. The visiting cards, nobody ever knew what to do with. There was a huge bin or a vat up in the attic that was part of the water system and that was no longer used. They basically started throwing all the calling cards in there. The Lincoln boys had crawled in this, created a snowstorm by throwing these things up. They found an old chair from the Monroe administration, nailed a copy of the Congressional Record to the bottom of it, threw those cards on the stairs and was sliding down the steps on that old chair. And that was the snowstorm, the sled riding trip they had. Another one of the events that took place in the White House was a great play and promotion that they put on. Some of these things were done in blackface, where they would put the black makeup on their face and put on a farce of a show or something. One of the things that they did in one of these plays, they came down and literally interrupted a cabinet meeting taking place with their father and the group of ministers, the cabinet officers. Paul, you've got to come upstairs. We're putting on a play for you. And Lincoln literally dismissed the cabinet meeting. They all adjourned to the attic of the White House and watched the Taft boys and a couple other boys and his own sons put on this play for him upstairs. One of the things that they sang at that program was Old Abe Lincoln Came Out of the Wilderness. Now, I don't know, does anybody in here know that song? Old Abe Lincoln came out of the wilderness, out of the wilderness. We sing that at Van W. I think it's absolutely the corniest song I've ever sang in my life. Miss Birchie wants to sing that at the State House. We've done it every year for years over there at Van W. I did not realize that song was actually a campaign song from the Lincoln presidential campaign of 1860. And so the boys, I'd like to imagine the great solemn face, the bearded face of Abraham Lincoln sitting up there just laughing and slapping his knee at his boys singing Old Abe Lincoln Came Out of the Wilderness. Lincoln was a rather formal man. He didn't show his emotions very much, probably more so in the White House than anywhere else. Around his boys, it was a different story. Lincoln was very much wont to sit down in a big old chair, throw one boy over his knee, grab the other one, pull him up to the side. He'd reach out with a long arm and grab poor little Julia and drag her into it. She was a regular little Southern belle. He would drag her in the fray and start telling about the Indians that had slain a man on the western frontiers. He may have been telling a story about his own grandfather who had been actually murdered by Indians on the Kentucky frontiers. But then he would say, Tad would say, Pa, tell us, what happened to the Indian? What happened to the Indian? He'd say, he did just like I'm going to do. He silently stole away, at which he would jump up and dash out of the room and try and get back to business. Those were some of the happy-go-lucky stories and events that took place during the very early years. This, mind you, was before the devastating battles of Antietam and Gettysburg, and the many failures that the Union Army was going to have to suffer through those years of the Civil War. It really wasn't until the very last years of the Civil War that the manpower literally came on strong for Lincoln. We had enough people in the northern populated states to populate an army very well. The Southerners were literally running out of people. They had better equipped, we had better equipped soldiers and more men to deal with. They had better trained officers. And on more than one occasion, I won't talk and get into the Civil War history too much with you, but on more than one occasion, the Southern armies were very, very close to literally breaking this Union apart and separating us into a Northern United States and a Southern United States. They were very, very dangerously close to that happening. Lincoln was able to pull together his cabinet, his officers, and keep these men behind him, and put together a good army, a good team of officers that finally would go on to win the American Civil War, bringing this country together, keeping it the Union that it is, as said about in the Constitution. But there were very many trying days ahead of him. Sadly, in 1862, February of 1862, Willie, the older of his two young sons, came down with typhoid fever. Willie lay ill in the White House altogether for about 4 or 5 weeks, literally from Christmas of 1861, from the snowstorm I told you about earlier, up through about the middle of February. He did pass away there in the White House. There was a state funeral for him held in the East Room of the White House. His casket was placed in a grave of a man named Carroll out in Washington, D.C., in a crypt out there, and there it would remain for several years. Whenever the Lincoln funeral train came back to Springfield in 1865, during a month-long trip that the funeral train took, it carried 2 Lincolns in it. It brought Willie and Abraham Lincoln back home. Tad Lincoln lived to be about 17, 18 years old. After the White House years, Tad and his mother came back to the Chicago area and lived with Robert. Robert met and wed a senator's daughter, Senator Harlan's daughter, from out in Washington. He was a senator. Senator Harlan was a very good supporter of the Lincoln administration. He was a senator from Iowa. Robert became enamored with his daughter, and a romance started and flourished, and eventually they were wed. Robert Lincoln had several children as well with Mary Harlan Lincoln, and they raised their family in Chicago for a number of years. Tad stayed with his mother there for various reasons, basically a fear of being out of money and fear of the United States press. The United States press just followed her. Mrs. Lincoln was kind of a celebrity in her own time, not unlike we had today. Very unfavorable press followed her wherever she went. She constantly imagined herself to be out of money. She had some means. She enjoyed living beyond them. She decided to try and sell her old used clothes and garments and gowns from the White House. After the death of her husband, she was thrown into deep mourning and depression. She never wore anything colored again. She always wore black clothing, very heavily draped in mourning, heavy veils. She went places using assumed names so people wouldn't know who she was. She finally decided to live abroad. She moved to Europe, and Tad finally received his education. Tad could barely speak. He had a lisp, a very pronounced lisp. Very little schooling or anything else that he ever had in the White House years of Abraham and Mary Lincoln let him just grow up kind of wild and free. It wasn't until he was about 13, 14 years old that he really started to attend school and learn his letters and numbers and so forth. He was in Europe and came down very sick with a cold, basically came back to the States and lived for several months through doctoring and treatment and so forth, but he too passed away up here in Chicago. that was pretty much the last straw for poor Mrs. Lincoln. She couldn't hardly take anymore. Her other son had to have her committed. Robert had to have her committed to an asylum up in the Chicago area out of Kaegy, Illinois, and she was only in there a few months. Basically, I think she was in there long enough to get over the deep mourning and depression suffered after Tad's loss, and then she ended up living with her sister in Springfield for her remaining years. Probably the only happy times in her life was being around her grandchildren. She had a couple granddaughters that she became very fond of and very close to. All of the Lincolns are basically buried in Springfield, other than the son Robert, the oldest son of Abraham Lincoln, lived a very full life. He became a very successful attorney. He was a very prominent businessman in the Chicago area. He served as Secretary of War during Secretary of the Navy during the Garfield administration.
He was in the war too.
Pardon me?
He was in the Secretary of the War too.
Yeah. Okay. Maybe that is the Secretary of War that he served in the Garfield administration. He was eventually promoted through his legal dealings as the head of the Pullman Car Company in Chicago. He made quite a fortune. He eventually ended up moving from the Chicago area, from the North Shore of Chicago, out to New Hampshire. He had a home in Washington, D.C., and in the New Hampshire mountains. His home, named Hildene, is a museum and so forth out in that state. It has just been turned into that. He had several children and grandchildren. The last of his grandchildren have since passed away, and there has passed the Lincoln family name. Now, the things that I brought to show you this evening, there's several collections of things up here. A couple of books that I brought just to mention about. Herndon's Lincoln. This is the little 3-volume set printed in the 1880s. Herndon sold his notes to 2 or 3 biographers before they were finally published under his own name. He finally put together his own set of books, and as I mentioned, this set of books are fairly hard to find in the original edition, but have been reprinted time and time again. You can't hardly read a biography about Lincoln that you don't have to refer to some of Herndon's material, because a lot of the things that he interviewed and people he talked with, nobody else had the opportunity to talk to, so everybody is pretty much indebted to him, even though in that period of time a lot of his notes were kind of thrown aside as hearsay, especially because of the Rutledge accounts and several other things. Herndon's biggest, probably the most controversial thing he touched on in his book was about the paternity of Lincoln, whether Abraham Lincoln was really the son of Thomas Lincoln. Since then, time has proven and records have been found and so forth showing the wedding dates and so forth. Herndon just didn't have access to the right information on that. He just assumed the worst. And he printed it, which in Victorian times was a very unpopular thing to do. The little book here is called Behind the Scenes. This is kind of an interesting book. 30 Years a Slave and 4 Years in the White House by Elizabeth Keckley. Miss Keckley was a very close confidant of Mary Lincoln. She was the seamstress in the White House during 4 years. She had a rather remarkable life, bought herself out of slavery in St. Louis, went to Washington to become a seamstress, served in several prominent families, most notably Jefferson Davis. He was a senator. She'd served his family very well. She also served Senator Stephen Douglas from our state. This little book is a brand new one that's out. It's called Lincoln as I Knew Him, Gossip, Tributes, and Revelations from His Best Friends and Worst Enemies by Harold Holzer. What Professor Holzer has done in this book, and this is available about $14 from Barnes & Noble and some of the new bookstores. That's an extraordinary book. It covers a lot of reminiscing about Lincoln. Lincoln as he was remembered by Stephen Douglas and by General McClellan, as remembered by Lizzie Keckley and Julia Bain that I've already mentioned earlier in the talk. This little book, I think you can still purchase. It's called When Lincoln Came to Egypt. This has always been one of my favorites. This talks very prominently about Lincoln's visits here in Greenville, Illinois. What that is, John Simon wrote the foreword to this. Dr. George Smith was a professor of history at SIU Carbondale from about 1910 through 1940. As he approached his 90th birthday, he took all of his collected stories about Abraham Lincoln's visit to Carmi, Illinois, and El Dorado, Illinois, and did research here in Greenville and contacted families here about Lincoln's visits to southern Illinois. And this is all people reminiscing about Lincoln and his visits, his legal cases, and so forth that he handled throughout the southern one-third of Illinois. He was fairly well known down here, although he didn't practice law here. The last book I've got is Lincoln Day by Day. I think this is rather fascinating. I like just showing this because most people have no idea this is available. Every once in a while you hear, oh, Lincoln spoke here, gave a talk here, and you think, well, I don't know if Lincoln was really there or not. He was a very prominent public man in some respects. You can look through old journals and magazines and so forth, find articles about legal cases he was handling, and pretty well pinpoint where he was on a day-by-day basis. Paul Angle with the State Historical Society started putting this collection together. It's a 3-volume set, and it literally covers every known day of his life, according to letters, diaries, and everything. They're still continuing to add to that. So whenever you hear the peers say in Carlisle, Illinois, that Lincoln visited here on such and such a day and stayed at the old Truesdale Hotel, the fact is you can look under that date in here and find out he was practicing law in a case in Beacon, Illinois, and you can pretty much throw aside the story that you hear down south. Now, the collection and collectibles I've got, there's a little bit of everything up here. And you're welcome I'll be glad to answer any questions while you're visiting and moving around this evening, but I'm just going to briefly tell you what some of the things are. A couple of my favorites are right here. The 2 little buttons in this case are not in very good shape, but they are actual political tokens from Abraham Lincoln and Stephen Douglas's presidential campaign. They're called a ferrotype. It's an actual tin type set in a little brass frame. If I had them out of the box, you could see on the back side is their vice presidential running mates. The Stephen Douglas piece is here. It was made in 1860 for the 1860 campaign. The Lincoln piece I have is from the 1864 campaign. This little ribbon is a GAR ribbon. The Grand Army of the Republic was kind of the forerunner. It was for Civil War veterans what the VFW and American Legion is today. This was like a reunion badge, and this is a picture of the man. It says, "We voted for Lincoln" on it. This is about a 1910 reunion of the GAR up here on the courthouse square, and that's the ribbon they have. This little piece is a picture of Abraham Lincoln and Tad. It was taken in 1864. They're in Matthew Brady's studio. Alexander Gardner took the photograph on April 9th. They're looking at a photograph album. Lincoln was there for a sitting that included the $5 bill pose and several other very well. The penny pose is a profile view taken of Lincoln. The $5 bill pose was taken the same day. After they had taken several of the poses, Lincoln was sitting there looking at a photograph album with his son, and Brady just snapped a picture. That's how they got that. It became absolutely one of the most well-known pictures of Lincoln that was ever made. It was kind of an impromptu one taken. The picture of Mrs. Lincoln with it was taken in 1861 in her inaugural gown. These are my first 2 Lincoln pieces that I got. These came from an old family Bible in our family. I guess I was always a Barna collector or something. I was rooting around in my aunt's basement when I was about 5 or 6 years old, prying around in something I probably had no business getting into, and I'm opening up this old musty book sitting on a shelf in the basement. It's the old Beckham family Bible, and I flip open the book and I'm looking at it, and lo and behold, here's a picture, an original picture of Abraham Lincoln. Well, that's sweet. So I go up and ask about it, and was promptly said, "Stay out of that box of stuff. What are you doing down there anyway?" I guess I was a little tad of some sort, my brother and I. About 7-10 years later, something like that, my aunt handed my mom a box full of old musty papers and happened to be a couple old Bibles. And boy, I remembered that just like that. I jumped on that, whipped open that Bible, and sure enough, they'd taken the family pictures out of the book, but they left Abraham and Mary Lincoln in. I'd rather have that than the family pictures, to tell you the truth. Those are what is called a carte de visite. The way they were made is Brady or Gardner or whoever the photographers were, they had a big old camera that had 4 lenses on it. And they would make a negative on a piece of glass. It was called a glass plate slider, glass plate negative. They would take that or take a shot of Lincoln, and there'd be 4 poses. You could tell by the shadows on them where the 4 poses were. You know, you'd have shadows different directions on them. There's collectors that have collected all 4 poses of each card. They would cut that thing in 4 pieces. They would send it to the studios in Washington and in Chicago and in New York, and they would start printing these things. And they would print these and hand them out as visiting. They were printed by the thousands. They were at one time rather common, but they're rather hard to find now. These 2 pieces are lithographs. That's where Brady would take a photograph, they would give it to an artist. The artist would make an engraving on a steel plate so they could print it and reprint it in newspapers and so forth. These came out of old atlases or books at some time. This one is of Senator Stephen Douglas, who of course debated Lincoln for the Senate's race in 1858 here in Illinois. That's what brought them both to Greenville. In 1860, they later were running for president against each other. These 2 pieces, this is a replica of the Lincoln dinner china, and this is a Christmas ornament from the White House this past year, is what that is. These are postcards from the turn of the century. They date to about 1909. There was a lot of memorabilia and Lincoln collectibles put out around the anniversary of his birth. And of course, 1909 is when they introduced the Lincoln penny and so forth. That's when so many of these things were popular. Here's a couple more CDVs, a carte de visite, they usually call a CDV. These two are originals, I just haven't got them framed up. Most of mine are framed like that and hang on the wall at home. This is called a stereo card. When you look at that through an old stereoscope, you see it in 3 dimension. That was made in right around the turn of the century. It shows our 3 martyred presidents. It shows Lincoln, Garfield, and McKinley. So it would have been made about 1900 whenever McKinley was assassinated. This is another little GAR badge and a stereo card of the White House from the 1880s. And this is a Lincoln deathbed scene. That was a very popular type print. They would print up, I think altogether, the night Abraham Lincoln was assassinated, they carried him across the street to the Peterson house, which was a small boarding house, and there was a little tiny bedroom in the back. I think 12 by 14 foot room. Altogether, about 80 people visited the president that evening. 60 or 80 people visited the president's deathbed that evening to pay their last respects. Numerous artists painted pictures and prints and so forth of all the people that were there. Realistically, he had about 2 doctors and his son and 1 or 2 visitors at any given time, but the artists always show people sitting in a room as big as this to hold everything. The fact is, it was actually a very small room that they came and went from. This piece shows just different presidents. This was from 1887. These were like cutouts from a kid's scrapbook, and I just remounted them in here. And this just shows a few other bric-a-brac, another GAR badge, a postcard of the Lincoln home, and so forth. So with that, I'll bring things to a close. I will be glad to answer any questions I can for you this evening. I think that'll finish us, and looks like Harry's getting food set up over here. So,
Thanks,
Kevin.
That's really interesting.
Anybody have any questions this evening, or?
When did you actually get started with scripture?
I would say it probably dates back to the 7th grade. I had a history class with Kaegy, and I had a lot of respect for that. But she was remarkable and a very, very good teacher. I always enjoyed history, Mary. I can't think when I didn't enjoy history. Folks take us on vacation. We go to Civil War battlefields, Gettysburg, and things of that nature. But I was probably more interested. I remember going to Gettysburg when I was a little kid with Dad and Mom. Mike hated it. Still does. He's not into that at all. We're different night and day on some respects. But I was always somewhat interested in these things, but I suppose probably in the 7th grade, I remember Mrs. Allen doing some programs on history in the junior high. And one of the things we talked about was doing family histories and getting into it. And I remember starting to do history and looking up history about Dudleyville. And I found that rather interesting. I started finding out that one of my ancestors was a blacksmith and one was a butcher, and they basically helped run this little tiny town. And of course, living there, and you know, our family, I guess, I take it for granted. I just assume that everybody lives in a house with a shoebox full of arrowheads and antiques. And I know that that is not really the case. We were raised a little different than some. We live in a house full of antiques, relics, and so forth, and you just come to appreciate those things. I know at my dad's house, my great-granddad Kaegy farmed that place with horses till 1960. Midnight, that hasn't been that long ago. But he was still farming with horses. After he passed away, all of the harness and stuff was hanging in the barn with his butchering tools and his father's blacksmithing tools, and they're there to this day. When my dad decides he doesn't want that in the barn, I'll probably move it to my barn and still keep it. I don't know, I guess when you're raised around stuff like that, you just kind of have a natural interest in it. I started becoming interested in history probably the most. I've had these for a number. I've had these since I was probably 12 or 13 years old. This pair of pictures framed up like this. I was always rather interested in Lincoln, and then I went to an auction a number of years ago. There was a lady school bus driver I had named Virginia Shaw. I'm sure most of you people remember Virginia Shaw. She was quite a talker and quite a local character. Her dad was an old man named Carter Lee, and he was more of a collector than even myself. He had all kinds of stuff. I remember her talking about Dad has a chair down in the basement that Abraham Lincoln sat in. I thought, that's kind of neat. A few years later, I was a junior at Greenville College, and I saw they were having an auction up there at Carter Lee's and getting rid of all that stuff out of that old house. And I remembered that, and I called up to me, I said, "This is Kevin Kaegy. You remember me? You told me once years ago your dad had a chair Abraham Lincoln sat in. Are you going to sell that?" She says, "Yeah, we're going to sell that." I went and bought it. I thought, yeah, it's down in the barn. I've never yet fixed it up. Got talking to her and looking this thing over. It dates the right period of time. Turns out the chair that I bought came out of what they called the old Smith Mansion. Got it from the Cox family, I think, ended up living there, where the Illinois Bell building was. There used to be an old brick house there. That house had been built by a man named William S. Smith. He was a merchant here in town. Abraham Lincoln visited in that house. He was there the night that he spoke in Greenville. He was entertained up there in the parlor in that old house, and that old chair had stayed in the house for a number of years. Carter Lee was interested in stuff, and the Coxes ended up living there through the 40s and 50s and had some of the Smith furniture, and they gave him that old chair to preserve, and he cared for it all those years, and I've had it at my house since. One of these days I'm going to find a couple wingback chairs to sit with it and recover them. Once I got the chair, I started looking up more Lincoln stuff. Now I've got, you're looking at just a small percentage of the collection I've got. This is the stuff I keep put away. The rest of it's hanging out on the walls. But altogether, when we moved last May, we moved probably 1,000 books. Better than half of them were about Abraham Lincoln. I didn't scratch the surface on him, on books. Most of the things I have are reminiscing of Lincoln, and most of them about his career in Illinois. I'm rather interested in those pre-presidential years. So, anything else?
Everybody's enjoyed it. Everybody enjoyed it.
Glad you did. Feel free to browse around and take a look. You'll see a few goodies up here you probably won't see every day. Once in a while, I haul stuff up to the museum. And we still got to get a Lincoln display over there. I can't hardly not put a Lincoln display over there in that museum. I need to get something up over here.
We're going to have to expand upstairs some of these days.
Yep, we're going to expand upstairs and just keep growing. So, yeah, Steve.
When the Watts Girl stuff was sold, my mom bought well, I guess it was a work basket, so big, and it had, I don't know what it had in it, but in there was a campaign button for Hannibal Hamlin.
And that was vice president during Lincoln's first 4 years.
Even after I was there, I was there.
I have,
That's a neat collectible to have. I'm sure there aren't too many of them around.
well,
Kinda tough to
we had to do a little
His sister, the lady who married me.
prying to find out what it was, but,
What's the lady in town? I think it was,
don't just throw a
she lived on the
basket of stuff like that away just because you don't think it's worth anything.
In fact, you've never thrown anything away yet. You're about third generation saver, aren't you, Steve? You got a pretty good collection too, don't you?
Oh, I got a few pieces.
Like I say, you can go ahead and browse around, come on, you take a look at some of the things. A few of the books, if you're interested in, go right ahead and look at that. A few of them you can still purchase. I know that these three you can get sold.
There's some tape for you.
Some of that?
There's some tape for you.
Oh, okay.
Did Robert Lincoln, how many children did he have that lived?
3. He had 2 daughters and he had a son, and his son's name was Abraham Lincoln, and they called him Jack. And that boy, Robert, served as a minister to England for a number of years, and that boy got sick when they were in England, and he died over there. And the 2 girls, Jessie was one of their names, I cannot remember the other name, but both of those girls married. Oh, it was Jessie and Mary. The one was named after Mary Lincoln, and the other one was named Jessie. And both of those girls did marry, and they in turn had daughters and sons and so forth, and those were the last 3. I think altogether it was 3 great-grandchildren. And the last of those had just passed away. His name was Beckwith. Robert Todd Lincoln Beckwith was his name. He lived down in Kentucky, and he passed away a couple of years ago.
So they didn't know anything?
No, none of those great-grandchildren had any